Father, thank you so much for a chance once again to come before you and to hear your word. I pray that you would speak to us and just thank you for your goodness. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. First of all, I want to thank everybody who, I noticed a bunch of people chose to bump up and sit on the front row. You guys are awesome. And thank you to everybody who chose to take a turn sitting in the fellowship hall too. We had 25 people or more in there, and so that's pretty cool. I love that we're in a church that cares about people and wants there to be extra seats. I think that's just fantastic. Well, today is the week that we cover a question, and the question that we have is about Uzzah touching the ark. All right? And that is in 2 Samuel chapter 6. Or you best to go to 2 Samuel chapter 6, that's where I'm going to be, but it's also covered in 1 Chronicles 13, 8 through 6. And so to get some background for this, I want you to tell that David was in this interesting situation that long before he became king, he had the opportunity to think about what it was going to be like to be king. Most people, they know they're going to be king because their dad or their mom or whatever, they know they're going to be the next monarch. They got time. Imagine how long King Charles has been thinking about this. When I'm king, I tell you what, he didn't know he had to wait so long. But David also knew because God told him, you're going to be the next king. And so he had time to think about it and to prepare. And Israel was a divided nation. The 10 tribes didn't get along with the 2 tribes. Benjamin and Judah didn't get along with the other ones. And so much so that even long before they've split parts, David, when he counts them, they're counted separately. Okay, here's the north end of the kingdom, here's the south end of the kingdom. When Saul had ruled, he had ruled kind of from a more southern capital, but David thought, you know what, I'm going to put the capital more center when I become king, I'm going to make the capital be the center of the empire. And so he looked around, and he also said, I want to pick a place that's in neutral territory. The United States had to do this. I know that now it seems like Washington, D.C. is not very central. But with the original 13 colonies, it was a pretty good location. And in order to make it the capital, Virginia had to cede that part of the state and say, we're going to give this up so that it's not part of Virginia anymore, even though that's why they wanted it there, because they wanted the capital in Virginia. New York wanted the capital to be New York. But they said, we're going to pick a place where there isn't a town. And they ended up picking the swampy area around Washington, D.C., partly because it was central, partly because nobody wanted it. And they started building a capital there because a brand new place. Well, David looks around through the nation of Israel and he says, where could I put it? Jerusalem. Jerusalem. We were supposed to conquer that with Joshua, but we never did because the Jerusalem managed to, because of their fortifications and their water system and things, they managed to defend themselves against the people of Joshua. So for hundreds of years, the Jebusites have been living there. And he said, it's a central place, but it doesn't belong to any of the tribes. And we have this command to conquer it. It's also spiritually significant. A lot of things happened on Mount Zion there in that specific area. And that's where Melchizedek, the king of Salem, was. And so he's like, I'm going to conquer Jerusalem. If I ever become king, that's what I'm going to do. And we know that this was in his mind partially because when he kills Goliath, he cuts off Goliath's head. And a lot of us miss what happens next. He takes Goliath's head and he brings it to Jerusalem. And when you read that over in the Bible, you think, oh yeah, well, he took it to Jerusalem, of course, because that's the capital. But it wasn't the capital yet. It wasn't even an Israelite territory. It was a Jebusite territory. But David has already been told he's going to be king. He's just had the triumphal moment where he's killed Goliath. He takes Goliath's head and he brings it to Jerusalem because he knows one day I'm going to make that my capital. And so finally, when David is crowned king, he's first crowned king of the southern tribes because Judah kind of liked the idea of having a Judah king. And The northern tribes took a little bit more convincing, but eventually when they merged and they made David their king, David said, okay, I'm going to make Jerusalem my capital. And so he gathered all of his soldiers around the outside, and he says, hey, here's what we're going to do. We're going to do a sneak attack into the city of Jerusalem. I love this story. It has very little to do with what we're talking about. But I love this story. It's too good. I tell you what, David's life is more cool than any movie ever. It is crazy, the life that David lived. So he's gathered out with his generals, and he has one general that's kind of troublesome, his head general, Joab, who's a cousin, and he's actually a niece, and he can't really fire him because of that. Nephew, that's the word, nephew. That's right. Yeah, okay, yeah, fair enough. All right, it's his nephew, and he can't really fire him, and all that. But Joab has just been trouble from the beginning, and so even though Joab's his lead commander, he's like, here's an opportunity for me to get a new commander. And so he's like, hey, here's what we're going to do. There's this well just outside the city, and they've dug a tunnel to it to get water inside the city. And that's how they are able to endure siege, and they've got these great walls and stuff. So we're going to have somebody swim through, a group of somebodies, swim through the cistern thing, and then climb up the tunnel well thing, which is nothing like the one that's there now. You would have had to climb up a rock face, and then fight their way to the gates and open the gates, and then we'll take the city. And whoever is the first one through to the city gate is going to be my new general. And Joab's like, what? It doesn't say that part, but I'm sure he did. And so Joab grabs a couple of guys and jumps in. And lo and behold, Joab and his group of guys make it through, swim through, fight their way to the door, and they open up the gate, and Joab remains David's top general. And they take the city of Jerusalem, and because it wasn't part of any of the tribes, because it's centrally located, it becomes the new capital of Israel. And Joab is trouble from then on, and when David is about to die, he tells Solomon, hey, when you're king, I left Joab alive, but you don't let Joab die of natural causes. That's what he says. And Solomon doesn't. Anyway, so that's the story of the city of Jerusalem. Well, in the meantime, the Ark of the Covenant has been kept at Shiloh. And it's been moved around to various locations and things, but it hasn't been at the capital. But David's like, hey, this is the capital now. And it shouldn't just be the political capital, it should be the spiritual capital. Our nation follows God, and so I want the tabernacle to be brought here. And so he sends out instructions, and the Ark of the Covenant has been with Abinadab and his household. And at the beginning of verse 6, it says, David again gathered the chosen men of Israel, 30,000, and David arose and went with all the people who were with him to Baal Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who sits enthroned on cherubim. Notice at the beginning of this how it introduces the ark. Okay? It doesn't say, yeah, they went to get the Ark of the Covenant. It says they went up from there to bring the Ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord, all caps, Yahweh, of hosts, of armies. This is God's powerful name, who sits enthroned on the cherubim. On top of the Ark of the Covenant are two angels. When angels have wings, they're called cherubim. Their wings almost touch. And in that place, that's supposed to represent God's presence. And so he says, this is God's presence, sitting enthroned on the Ark of the Covenant, the Lord of hosts, Yahweh. Okay? That's what they're going to get. Next verse. And they carried the Ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were driving the new cart with the ark of God, and Ahio went before the ark. So you got Ahio in front, leading the ark, probably holding on to the it says oxen, right? I didn't see oxen. I felt like it said oxen. Maybe not. And then you've got Uzzah kind of walking alongside, checking on it, making sure. Now, what's wrong so far? They're not carrying it. There were specific instructions in Numbers 4 that this ark was supposed to be carried. It was supposed to have the poles attached. That's how it's going to be dealt with. In fact, not only was it supposed to be carried on those poles, only descendants of the Kohathites, which there's no evidence that Uzzah and Abinadab were. In fact, it doesn't seem like they were. They weren't supposed to have any hand in it at all. It's just that's how it's supposed to be carried. That's who it's supposed to be carried. It's not supposed to be riding on a cart. Where do you suppose they got the idea of putting it on a cart? They were tired, maybe. Actually, so there's another story. Back in when Samuel was the judge in Israel. In fact, when Samuel was a very young man, before he's a judge, he has that vision or that conversation with God in the tabernacle, right? Where he's sleeping, he has a conversation with God, and God tells him, hey, Eli, the high priest, his sons are going to die, all right? And it's because they've been unfaithful and they haven't been good. And so the last straw is that I think I just lost their names. Something and Abihu or something. Nadab and Abihu? All right, I'm going to go with him, with Tim. Tim knows. If it's wrong, it's his fault. But anyway, he says they're going to die. And so Nadab and Abihu, the Philistines attack, just like always. And Nadab and Abihu are like, you know what will help us in this battle? The ark. So they grab the ark, and they put the poles in it, and they walk out to the battle. But they're using the ark kind of like just this magic talisman. They haven't been following God. They've been unspeakable. God's already pronounced judgment on them. They've been taking bribes. They've been abusing their power and authority. And Eli, the high priest, has been looking the other way because they're his sons. And what happens is God does not honor that. You can't use the ark like some magic talisman. That's not what it's for. You're supposed to use that in reverence and in worship. And so God allows the Philistines to kill everybody around the ark, including Nadab and Abihu. And there's a famous scene where Eli is old and fat. They like this at camp. They like stories about people who are old and fat in camp. And so he's sitting on the fence, and he hears a runner coming up, and they say, hey, he says, what's news of the battle? And he says, well, your son's died. And so Eli falls off backwards and breaks his neck. And kids at camp like to fall off backwards things. And so happens at camp every year. Anyway, the ark is captured by the Philistines. How could God let that happen? And the Philistines lead that, and they bring it into a temple to Dagon. And there's the old thing, what happened to all these famous idols in the Bible? Dagon. But anyway, they lead him to the temple of Dagon, and Dagon is pretty much like a mermaid. He's got the body of a fish and the head of a man, and sometimes the head's here, and sometimes he has arms, sometimes he doesn't, but he's like a mer person, okay? And he's an idol, so he's carved. Obviously, he's not real. He's carved and standing there, and they bring the ark like other trophies from battle, and they put it in front of Dagon as an offering. What happens is, in the night, Dagon falls over. So you can imagine Dagon in this great pose. He falls flat in front of the ark in the night. And the priests come in, and they're like horrified. Oh, no, what happened? Who was in here? And they lift it back up. Obviously, a very powerful God if he had to be lifted back in place. But and what happens is he falls again. when he falls the last time, his hands and his head break off in the fall. Crunch. And it says that the priests came in and didn't know what to do, so they just did their duties and they stepped over the idol. It says, and they kept moving. Anyway, because of the ark, God leads all kinds of plagues on the Philistines. And finally the Philistines are like, okay, I don't know why we beat you in battle, but we realize your God at least is real. And so they put the Ark of the Covenant on a cart. And they get a couple of cows who have just calved. And they hitch them to the cart. And they set them off. And you would think a couple of cows that had just calved would head back to the stall to find their calves. But instead, these cows pulled the ark by itself all the way into the nation of Israel, and where Samuel and the other Israelites welcome it back. Anyway, the ark God protects his own ark. Yeah. Hophni and Phinehas, Nadab and Abihu are Aaron's sons who bring the strange fire. Hophni and Phinehas, those are great names. But don't name your kids those because they were bad guys. Anyway, so you can imagine what it was like for these Israelites. They were like, boy, these Philistines, this ark just comes right back to us on this cart. So maybe they thought the cart was a good idea from that. But that's the only other time we know that the ark was put on a cart. And it was done by the Philistines who didn't know any better. And it was done to get rid of the ark because they were done with it and scared with it. And so when they come to move the ark again, instead of looking to see what God's instructions were, they're like, hey, let's put it on a cart. But this time, instead of letting God lead the way, we'll lead the way. And that's what they do. So, going down the road, here's the part nobody likes. And David and all the house of Israel were celebrating before the Lord with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. And when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah put out his hand to the ark and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. The oxen stumbled, the cart jerks, the ark maybe starts rocking back and forth, we don't know. But Uzzah puts out his hand. In verse 7, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him down because of his error, and he died there beside the ark. And everybody's like, is that really the kind of God that God is? That just to rescue the ark from falling on the ground, just accidentally. You can imagine how easy that'd be, right? You're walking against it, it starts tipping over. If something starts tipping over next to you, you're going to go like this. It's automatic, right? It's like when, have you ever tried falling face forward down on a mattress without putting your hands out? There are some crazy people who can do that because they don't have natural brains. But normal people, when you start to fall, your hands automatically go like this, right? That's why a lot of times it's your brake, not your arms that break, not your face, which is why you do that, right? But it's a natural thing. Oh, here comes an arm more. It's natural. Uzzah puts out his hand to steady the ark, and he dies. Is that fair? And so that's the question. And in light of the background, I want to point out to you several things about this. Number one, at the beginning of the story, it points out this is not just some box coming down the road. This is a representation of God's presence. And when Uzzah touched the ark, it was just a thoughtless, unintentional mistake. It was thoughtless, unintentional, and it was a mistake. But that is the point. The point is that everyone, including David here, was being thoughtless, careless, casual, and therefore irreverent toward the ark. There should have been no thoughtless activity connected with this, because this was a representation of God's presence, which means that from the beginning, they should have said, okay, before we even go anywhere near God's presence, what are we supposed to do? Before we even come close to this, let's read every passage in connection with this. Let's understand exactly what God says, because we're talking about a holy God, Yahweh, Jehovah, the Lord of hosts. We're talking about a representation of His presence where the Shekinah glory of God sometimes shines. We better know everything about how we're supposed to do this before we even make a move. Do you know that when they have a coronation, every single person involved in England, I don't know about other places, I know very little about England, but they have to memorize each of their places. They have all these roles, every single thing from their ribbon to their dagger to where the crown sits. Everything is scripted for all day long, and they have to follow all these rules, and there's people right next to them to say, nope, over here, go this way, and they have to have all of these responses memorized and ready to go. And so that Charles was working on that for years before it was his turn to do it. All of those protocols and all of those things. And this crown has to be put on a certain time, and then this crown has to be put on another time, and then they have to walk. They can't go over here because that would mean this, and they can't go over here. They have to do exactly this, and they have to do it in 10 steps. And all of that just to become King of England, when there's a parliament and all this other stuff, right, that has all the real power. How much more should David, who has been placed on the throne by God, have taken God seriously in this moment? Here's the other problem. Uzzah grew up around the ark. It's been kept at his place, his dad Abinadab's place. And so he's been around it so much that, okay, maybe when you just come around it, you'd have some reverence and awe. Wow, this is the Ark of the Covenant. This is what Joshua led through Jericho. What walked. This is that ark. That must have been amazing. But after a couple of days, after a week, after years of day after day being around the Ark of the Covenant, there's a tendency for us to get a little casual with God. By the way, this is a danger for all Christians. When we first come to God, we are amazed at who He is and what He's done for us. You remember that feeling when you first gave your life to Christ? Grace, so amazing, and you're so excited about it. And then over time, it kind of can, if we're not careful, cool off. Evidently, that's what happened to Uzzah here. He's grown casual around the ark. I remember when I was a kid, our neighbor, his name was Ernie. Ernie and Judy lived across the alley from us. And Ernie worked for the railroad, and we were driving down the road up in Warwood, Minnesota. We were out by Roosevelt, and we're driving down the road, and there was Ernie working at one of those little station houses. You know those little houses? They're not really stations. They're like little 4x4 huts like this tall, and they sit next to the railroad, and you drive past them. And I always wondered what was in one of those. And Dad must have wondered that too, because he pulled over because he saw Ernie working there. He's like, Ernie, what's in that? And so we're talking to Ernie, and I wander in there. And I'm looking around, and I swing my hand like this, and Ernie goes, whoa! He's like, and he pushes me out the door because evidently all of the little knobs and things on the wall were electrical, and one little touch of anything in that booth and I would have died. Well, I didn't realize that. I wasn't thinking about that. I was hanging out with Ernie and my dad, and I was just, just swinging my arms around. I was just a kid, but I forgot that, or I didn't realize the ultimate danger of what I was around. It's easy to get casual with things like that. Pilots, when they take off, have to follow this exact checklist, and they have to say it to each other, And they have to go through the whole process because there's a danger that you've done it so many times that you get so used to flying that you forget things and you stop having the fear that you should have as a pilot. And evidently that happened to Uzzah. The point here is that they were making a thoughtless, unintentional mistake when this should have been a moment of absolute reverence. Every single step should have been figured out and planned ahead of time. And then here's the other thing. They're kind of doing a little bit of the whole, the ark is a good luck charm thing. We do this with God sometimes, right? I'm going to have this job interview. God, please help me with this. I'm having a surgery. God, please help me with this. And we say our prayers, but our life doesn't reflect that. We're not treating God with reverence. We're treating him with like Santa Claus, right? And you see the difference there in that relationship that we're supposed to have? And so here they're celebrating, look at us here and leading the way, and they've got it on a cart and they're not paying attention. But in fact, God says, hey, I am holy. And that is a defining characteristic of me, something that Israel is not supposed to forget. In fact, the whole sacrificial system in the nation of Israel was based on God's holiness and the separation that sin causes from him. And so the ark, when it's set inside the tabernacle, sits in the holy of holy place. How many people get to go in there? One. How often? You guys are great. Then there's the holy place, outside of the Holy of Holies. Only certain people get to go in there. And that's where the furniture is and all those things. And between there's a thick curtain. And then there's another curtain. And then outside is the courtyard. And only certain people get to be in there. And it's for the special circumstance of having atoning sacrifices for their sins and going through the ceremonial washings and everything. And then when they'd have big ceremonies, there'd be people gathered outside of that fence. And all day long, day after day after day, there would be sacrifices and animals that are being killed and blood spilt on the altar outside of this. All to atone for sins because God was among them. Because in order to dwell in God's presence, to be around his holiness, they had to have this atonement for their sins. Oh, this isn't in my notes, but there's this great passage in Isaiah I read just recently because I'm reading through Isaiah right now, and I got to find it. Isaiah 33, starting halfway through verse 14. It's talking about God, and it's talking about how God can be a consuming fire. Right? So it's this picture of how powerful God is. And just like fire can be a great thing, it is also a dangerous thing. Okay? And so it says, who among us can dwell with the consuming fire? This is the problem of the Old Testament. God says, I'm going to be your God. I am holy, I am powerful, and he represents himself as a fire, and a pillar of fire at night, and a pillar of smoke in the day. And so it says, who among us can dwell with consuming fire? Who among us can dwell with everlasting burnings? And it says, he who walks righteously, who speaks uprightly, who despises the gain of oppressions, who shakes his hands lest they hold a bribe, who stops his ears from hearing bloodshed and shuts his eyes from looking on evil. He will dwell on the heights. His place of defense will be a fortress of rocks. His bread will be given him. His water will be sure. Now you listen to that. That's a pretty tall order to live that kind of righteously. But this is what the whole Old Testament system is about, this separation that causes. Now the amazing thing, and what makes this passage so hard for us to understand, is we live on the other side of the cross. We live in a time period where the curtain, as Jesus died, was ripped down from top to bottom, and suddenly shocked priests who had never been in the room, who didn't even know what the color of the walls were, who wondered what it was like back there, saw into the holy place. You just imagine you're standing there and rip. And the whole system was about that. And the shock and the amazement. And we live because God says that through Jesus Christ, all of us, having our hearts sprinkled clean, it says in Hebrews 10, and our bodies washed with pure water, we can come boldly in front of God. There's no separation anymore in His presence. We can come before Him freely. We can be in God's presence. Why? Because the atoning sacrifice has been paid. Jesus' death. But we can't forget that the reason why we can be in God's presence is because Jesus died. That is the kind of holy God He is. And so here's Uzzah walking along, and he's gotten casual. He's paying more attention probably to the crowd that's watching. Here he is, head of the parade. Isn't it a big honor? And suddenly the ark begins to shake, and he's so casual that he just lifts his hand up. Here's the other thing. I don't think this lesson was for Uzzah. Uzzah died instantly. He didn't get time to think about what he did. And I'm just going to tell you, we don't know what happened to Uzzah. God might have said, I'm not sending you to hell over one mistake. Or, we don't. God has that conversation with him right after that. Okay? That's none of our business. But it was for everybody else there, for the whole nation of Israel to see, wait a minute. Suddenly, everybody there realizes we have been too casual. I want you to notice the aftermath of this. Verse 8. And David was angry because the Lord had broken out against Uzzah. And the place was called Perez Uzzah to this day. That means the breaking out against Uzzah. So they called that space, they named that place. That's where God broke out against Uzzah. And David's mad. And so they call the parade to a halt. It says David was not willing. And David was afraid of the Lord that day, and he said, how can the ark of the Lord come to me? So David was not willing to take the ark of the Lord into the city of David, but David took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite. And the ark remained there in the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, for 3 months. And by the way, it says that the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all of his house. So David reacts he's like, first his reaction is anger. How dare God stop my parade? How dare he just in this, what did Uzzah do? He just put out his hand. But then as he reflects, he begins to be afraid. Wait a minute. If that's how the Ark of the Covenant is, I don't even want it around me. I don't want to bring it to the city of David. Now, it seems like from this passage that David's initial thing wasn't like, okay, let's pause, let's figure out what we're supposed to do, and then we'll move it. It says David wasn't willing to have it in Jerusalem. He's like, no. His initial reaction is like, then it's not coming to Jerusalem. If it's that dangerous, I don't want to be near it. That was his reaction. And but after time and reflection goes by, and after God does bless the house, it wasn't that God was against Israel. In Obed-Edom's house, he blesses the house because his ark is there. Hey, it's a blessing to be around God's presence. It's a good thing to be around God's presence. It's good for Israel. It's good for the nation. To be in God's presence brings blessings. And that's part of this story just as much as Uzzah dying. However, we can't be in God's presence casually. Now, if I was Obed-Edom, I'd be like, thank you for bringing this to my house. Can you imagine? I bet they did a chalk line around that thing and said, nobody go near that, and the grandkids can't come visit. you know? Just it must have been quite something. But God blesses. Yeah?
Oops, sorry, it wasn't supposed to come up. That's where they invented crime scene tape.
Maybe. Could be. I think, too, you have to look at this passage and say this wasn't just ordinary blessing either. This is enough that in a very short amount of time they realize something special is happening to Obed-Edom because the ark is there. And they were able to make that association. So what happens is they do move the ark to Jerusalem, but then everything is different. They take the time to make sure that they're doing it correctly. In fact, here's the reverence that they have for it when they move again. Verse 12. And it was told to King David, the Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark. So David thinks, oh, maybe it's not a bad idea to be around the ark. And so it says, so David went and brought the ark from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. And when those who bore the ark, it's not on a card anymore, those who bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 steps, he sacrificed an ox and a fattened animal. And David, so just imagine this. Now, you got the Kohathites holding it on their shoulders. They go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Everybody stop. We're going to have a sacrifice. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Everybody stop. We're going to have a sacrifice. All the way to Jerusalem. Can you imagine what that must have been like? How long this must have been taken? But it was done with reverence. We are going to take our sins seriously. We're going to take what it means to be in God's presence seriously. We are going to have it. We're going to do it exactly like he says, and we're going to have a sacrifice every 6 steps. We're going to go overboard if we have to in this process to get it there. But it wasn't as if either that they were doing this in grief and sadness. They were doing it with joy. In fact, in this 6-step march is another story famous at Bible camp. It's David dancing. Because what happens? David starts dancing, and he's so excited to be a part of this. There's everybody dancing. David's so excited that it says he takes off his outer robe. I know that there's a song that talks about dancing in your underwear. That's not what he was doing. He took off his outer royal robe, so he's dressed just like everybody else. Most people just wore that one tunic, and he takes off his outside royal robe, and he's dancing there. And in fact, Michal, who was Saul's daughter, who David had married and now he's back with, is like, that's not fitting for a king to be out there dancing with everybody else without your royal robe. That's not your job to do that. And David gives his famous line in verse 22, I will make myself yet more contemptible or undignified than this. I will be abased in your eyes. And David's like, whatever. I'm worshiping God. And then there's more to that passage we could talk about, but we'll stop right there. But anyway, I think that's what the message of Uzzah touching the ark is. I think it's a message for everybody. It's a message about taking God seriously. You see over and over again where God makes a gesture like this that's very serious and very, I don't want to use the word harsh, but where God has a dramatic judgment that he gives. And it's kind of as an example for the future. Notice in Genesis chapter 6, God looks down at the wickedness of the world, and he floods the entire world. Okay? And then afterward, he says, I'm not going to do this again. Why? Because the world's not going to be wicked again? No, it's going to get wicked again. But because God wanted to show them how seriously he takes sin. And what it means to dwell in his presence. So I think in this story, you have both the blessing of being in God's presence, and you have the holiness and danger of being in his presence. And that problem is solved by Jesus, who comes into this world, who is the sacrifice, so that in spite of our sins, we can be with God. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yes, Bob.
So, I understand that nobody was to touch the ark, right? That was part of we didn't talk a lot about that.
Right, only there's only one family, I think it's just the Kohathites, and then specifically certain descendants that are allowed to touch the ark. Everybody else couldn't.
Okay, because there was a mercy seat, so who sat on that and when?
Right, so the mercy seat was what they called the top of the ark. Nobody sat on it, but the ark was supposed to visually the picture you were supposed to get with the ark was that it was a footstool, right? It couldn't contain God or anything like that, but that it was for God sitting in heaven to rest his feet on, sort of, right? And the mercy seat was called that because that is where the sacrifice would sit. Not physically, they wouldn't bring the dead animal in there, but they would bring the blood. Once a year, Day of Atonement, they would bring the blood from the sacrifice. The high priest would carry it in there, and he would sprinkle it on that mercy seat. And you can imagine, since it didn't get washed, nobody's touching it, the sprinkles of thousands, or well, not thousands. Sorry, I'm doing some math. Almost 1,000 years of sprinkles and drops of blood on that top of the Ark of the Covenant. The stains and things from that. But that's why it was called the mercy seat, because of the mercy of the sacrifice. Mercy means that we're not given the penalty that we deserve. And instead, it was the blood of the sacrifice that was taken.
So the one other quick question is,
Yeah.
When every year the high priest would go in once a year to atone for sins and all that, I had heard I don't think it's written in the English Bibles, but I think history bears this out. Did they used to tie a rope around the high priest because if he collapsed or died or whatever, nobody could go in after him, so they had to drag him.
Yeah, we know that it was the tradition to tie a rope around the ankle of the high priest, so that when he went in to the holy place and he disappears behind the curtain, if he does something wrong in there, remembering Uzzah, and dies, they can't go in to get him. Only the next high priest can do that, and they have to go through the ceremonies and all that stuff. So they kept the rope around his ankle so that if he died, they could pull him out without going in. It's very practical. Also, you can imagine what kind of serious reminder that was to be walking in there with that rope around there, and these old high priests doing this, having that rope to trip around over. But they also, at the bottom of their ropes, they had these little jingly bell things, so that as they moved, they made a jingle every time they moved around. Jingle, 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 sprinkle, 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 jingle, jingle. All the stuff that they had to do. And so if they stopped moving, people outside to listen. You all right in there, Dad? And you assume that if he fell over, there'd be a big jingle.
Maybe that's where they got I'll Be There with bells on.
Yeah, well, maybe. You can just imagine, big jingle. You all right, Dad? Oh, I just tripped over this rope.
It seems like there's a fine line of how these people would treat this thing as to whether they just revere it or whether they would worship it as an idol.
Yeah. I do not know of anything else in history that compares to the Ark of the Covenant. Idol worship is universal around the world, but the Ark of the Covenant is a very unique bit of furniture, and it's very intentionally designed. God specifically laid it out. In fact, of furniture in the world, it is one of the only few things that God designed specifically, and he gives the most detail in how he wanted it made. Notice, everybody else, they got idols. They got a statue. They look spooky in the low lighting of a temple, and you can look at it and you can understand it maybe, and they make them look a little bit like people, but a little bit weird, and you can see where that would inspire worship. But God says, I am not something small like an idol. In fact, you're not even allowed to make an image of me. And so I'm much bigger than this temple can actually contain. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to make a box, and in the box I'm going to put reminders. I'm going to put my 10 commandments. I don't want you to forget how important those are. I'm going to put Aaron's rod, the budded, the story in the Bible that showed that it was Aaron's family. They're the high priests throughout history. That's going to be put in there. I'm going to put in there a little jar of manna, and so this list of special things that I'm going to put in there. You're not worshiping those things. Those are under my feet. You're going to encase this whole thing with gold, so you can't even look at the stone, like you're not worshiping the stone. It's in the box. And then on top of there, you're going to have not one, but 2 angels. If they'd just done one, they'd have started worshiping the angel. And the angels aren't supposed to be facing you. They're supposed to be facing each other. And they're not supposed to be touching each other. I want you to leave a gap between them. And in that gap, their wings are going to come together, and there's just this little space. That space is where you're supposed to direct your focus. Not at a thing, but at a gap. Because I am an unseen, holy God who lives and is real. There's no other religion in the world like that. There's just nothing that compares to it. It's unique in all of history, and it was something that God was very serious about, a lesson that he wanted them to get. In fact, if you read the 10 Commandments, when it tells them not to make an idol or an image, it says, of me. In other words, he's specifically telling them, do not make an image of me. Don't make me into an idol. Don't even try. And you remember when they make the golden calf? They worship it, and they say, this is the God who brought us out of Egypt, and they call it Lord. They call that calf Yahweh. And God's reaction is to kill a whole bunch of... at the right beginning of Israel, he's like, no, no, no. Do not try to turn the holy God, creator of the universe, into a cow. But we still do it today. In Romans, Paul says they worship the creature instead of the creator. And that was what the lesson that God wanted everybody to get. And so, in the Old Testament, it says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And so we have this relationship with God that involves a holy reverence. As C.S. Lewis said, he's not a tame lion. Right? He talks about God as a lion. He says he's not a tame lion. It's not like you can order him around. He's not some cat you can teach to do tricks. He's powerful. He's not a tame God. You don't know what he's going to do all the time. His ways are higher than your ways. You can't control him. And you should, in a sense, have fear of him. But he's good, is what C.S. Lewis says. So both of those things sit on the same shelf in the same character. What else? We got 3 more minutes.
I was just thinking, Bob, it's not just when they made the calf, when he reached out and touched that, when they put it on the cart, there was a long history of this kind of stuff. Nadab and Abihu got incinerated by God for messing up in the tabernacle. And so, it's not like there wasn't a history that they could, about this idea that you do it God's way or else when it comes to handling the ark and the worship in the temple, the tabernacle.
Yeah, and throughout history, in the Old Testament, it seems like each generation has to be reminded of this. And every time God gives them something that looks anything like an idol, they start worshiping it. You remember in the wandering in the desert, how God sends the snakes in to punish them, but he gives them a way out. He says, here's the cure I want you to take, and I want you to put this bronze snake up on a tree stick thing, and hold it up, and everybody who looks at that snake will be cured. And that's a beautiful picture of how Jesus became sin and died on a tree and all that. And they didn't know any of that, but we can see that because we're in the New Testament period, or in that era, right? However, we know that years later, that thing was still around. They didn't get rid of it. You wouldn't, would you? And they started to worship it as an idol. They'd started to worship the snake instead of the God who did the miracle. Which, by the way, is what Satan has tried to do from the beginning. And it's interesting how snake worship is so popular around the world. It's one of the most common idols, which everybody should just know that's the enemy right there. Okay, 30 seconds, that should be good to pray. If we have any more questions after that, we can go to it. But Father, you are the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the holy God, the Lord Yahweh of hosts. I pray that we wouldn't take you for granted, but that we would always remember your holiness. Thank you so much for the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross that takes away our sins so that we can live and be in your presence and even have you dwell inside of us. Thank you for that. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.